Hidden Figures. It's not exactly a novel observation to say that every audience member for every movie, or any consumer of art in general, brings their own personal experiences and circumstances to their consumption and assessment of said movie/art. Using another Best Picture nominee as an example, it wouldn't at all surprise me if someone with strong personal faith found Hacksaw Ridge more enjoyable than an atheist or agnostic person did. By the same line of thinking, it shouldn't be a surprise that someone with 2 degrees in aerospace engineering would be tickled by a movie that not only name drops Fortran and Euler's method, but uses them as plot points. But even beyond my predictable affinity for the subject matter, I think there's a whole lot to like about Hidden Figures, despite being a pretty conventionally told story. The bulk of the movie takes place in 1961, where Catherine Goebel, played by Taraji P. Henson, works as a computer, in that she literally computes things, as a part of the then segregated West Area Computers Division at NASA's Langley Research Center, alongside Mary Jackson, played by Janelle Monáe, and Dorothy Vaughan, played by Octavia Spencer. Following the successful launch of Sputnik, Catherine is moved to the Space Task Group under Al Harrison, played by Kevin Costner, where her considerable skills are needed to double-check other people's calculations, and where she's also the only woman on the team and the only black person in the entire building.
They never had a colored in here, but don't embarrass me.
This wasn't emptied last night.
I'm sorry, I'm not the...
Predictably, this doesn't exactly make her popular among her coworkers, chief among them head engineer Paul Stafford, played by Jim Parsons, but not necessarily because her coworkers are explicitly racist or sexist. It's framed as Stafford saying, "I don't need my work checked," but the barely concealed subtext is, "I don't need my work checked by someone like you." It's interesting to see dynamics like this play out. Segregation was still very much a thing at the time, and yet the talents of people like Catherine, Mary Jackson, and Dorothy Vaughan were very much needed, which made the employment of black women at NASA a really begrudging arrangement for some people. I guess that's what happens when your hatred of the Russians slightly outweighs your racism and sexism. Meanwhile, both Mary Jackson and Dorothy Vaughan both have their own parallel arcs and struggles. Mary Jackson wants to become an engineer, despite there being exactly 0 black female engineers at NASA at the time.
If you were a white male, would you wish to be an engineer?
I wouldn't have to. I'd already be one.
And has to petition a court to even be able to take the necessary coursework in the still segregated Virginia schools. Dorothy Vaughan has supervisor responsibilities at NASA, despite not having the supervisor title or the supervisor pay. She also has to figure out a way to keep herself and her entire team from becoming obsolete once NASA transitions from human computers to actual IBM computers. So the movie is more what I would call a layered biopic, in that it tells 3 almost entirely separate but thematically related stories. And I think it's remarkable to have 3 parallel plots and 3 satisfying-ish character arcs, even if one is given much more precedence over the others. Because the main storyline is Catherine's, she gets the most screen time, the most backstory, and the main dramatic conflict. We find out she's a widow, she has 3 young daughters at home, she has a romance subplot with National Guard officer Jim Johnson, played by Mahershala Ali, and she has a direct hand in the climax, facilitating John Glenn's orbit of Earth. So, I made a point to investigate the historical accuracy of Hacksaw Ridge. Not because I have a problem with historical inaccuracies per se, but just because if I see a plot point that's lame or cheesy, I want to know if that was an actual choice by the filmmakers, or if it was just them telling it like it happened. In the case of Hidden Figures, surprisingly, it seems that a lot of what's shown in the movie actually did happen. The timeline was just altered such that all 3 storylines happen simultaneously, so that they can all converge on John Glenn's historic orbit. In reality, Mary Jackson and Dorothy Vaughan's storylines happened a few years earlier than they're depicted in the movie, so presumably the 3 main characters likely weren't best friends as shown. I think I'm just self-conscious about giving a largely negative review of something most people liked, and so I feel the need to over-explain this point about historical accuracy, and why it bothered me in one case and less so in another. With the creative liberties that a movie takes, if things set up and pay off a little too well, you can kind of start to see the seams of the narrative. You can feel the screenwriter's presence, and it pulls you out of the immersion of the real-life story. Quite simply, it starts to feel predictable and manufactured, rather than organic and true. Hacksaw Ridge hangs so much of its narrative hat, so to speak, on things that are predictable and feel manufactured. While Hidden Figures has things like that, it's usually background stuff, and the main source of drama is more or less true to life. Just for example, apparently John Glenn really did request that Catherine herself personally double-check the numbers on his launch.
John, the IBM's wrong.
Let's get the girls to check the numbers.
Sure, it was days before the launch and not minutes, but still, all they did was adjust the timeline to make it more dramatic. That said, there are certainly some eye-roll moments in Hidden Figures. The eye-rolliest among them is how seemingly incompetent every non-Catherine character is. I get that Jim Parsons, and by extension the whole department, are supposed to be quasi-antagonistic, but they're still NASA engineers. And at times, it seems like they wouldn't even be able to wipe their own noses without Catherine telling them where their nostrils are. Speaking of historical accuracy, as you might expect, there are quite a few composite characters, which work or don't work to varying degrees. Paul Stafford doesn't really work because there's nothing to him, outside of being a stand-in for anyone who questioned whether Catherine belonged on the team. The Vivian Mitchell character, played by Kirsten Dunst, a foil to Dorothy Vaughn's supervisor aspirations, is a little bit more interesting than Stafford, solely because she's a walking, breathing case for intersectionality.
Be thankful you have jobs at all.
Kevin Costner's Al Harrison is basically a composite of every NASA supervisor. And while he's so clearly meant to be a POV character for progressive, white, modern audiences, he literally takes a crowbar to racism in one scene.
We all get there together, we don't get there at all.
I actually didn't mind his character. The three leads all give good performances, and their characters are interesting enough, even if their arcs are roughly what you're expecting. Mostly keeping their mouth shut through all the bullshit they have to put up with, but each eventually getting a nice moment where they stand up for themselves. I didn't love the romance subplot between Catherine and Jim Johnson, if for no other reason it was a little streamlined and didn't necessarily impact the overall plot. But here's the thing about that. Catherine's family, specifically her daughters, very much do figure into the overall plot, as the long hours at NASA keep her away from her family. Yet another thing she has to deal with.
You've been gone for 300 hours.
Was Mama gone for 12 and a half days?
No, but it felt like it.
It felt like it to me too.
To include her daughters in the movie, but not her husband, who she was married to for 56 years, would be kind of strange. Plus, it gives me a reason to watch more Mahershala Ali, and that is fine by me. But again, that complaint is more about something happening in the background. The main story is solid and compelling, mostly because it's ripe with conflict, which is the heart of drama. You have the immense, unbelievably difficult task of the math and science they had to do with the limited resources they had to do them with before the Russians.
Putting a human on top of a missile, shooting him into space, and it's never been done before.
In addition to also dealing with racism and sexism. Yes, it's mostly by the numbers, but it's also interesting, informative, and genuinely charming. A quality that I put a lot of stock into. It's a sentimental, inspiring crowd pleaser, which is exactly what it aims to be. And I have to mention that even though the narrative itself doesn't take a ton of risks, it's still a major Hollywood studio movie with 3 black women in the lead roles, mostly about characters doing math. So just by its mere existence, you can't exactly accuse the movie of playing it safe. Setting aside the fact that the bulk of the work they do is the opposite of cinematic, how many wide-release movies can you think of where there's even one black woman as the definitive lead role, let alone 3? Color Purple, Jackie Brown, The Help, I guess, Precious, Catwoman, Sister Act? Not an exhaustive list, just illustrating a point. So yeah, while it may be by the numbers, it still feels fresh in that regard. And it almost goes without saying, if even one young black girl sees these characters on screen and decides she wants to emulate them and go into math and science herself, I think we all win. That's not necessarily a reason to see the movie, though it is a bonus. The reason to see the movie is that it's good.